Which is the best sketchbook for you, and what sketchbook is best for nature journaling? In this video, I'm going to show you how to choose the best sketchbook for nature journaling based on what your needs are. I'm going to show you what mistakes to avoid when buying a nature journal and which ones are good for which purposes. Coming up. Wow, I am really excited, and I'm also a little nervous to share some of these sketchbooks with you because, as you probably know, I've settled in on one that I like a lot, but right now I'm going to go through all of these different ones that I've tried and share some of the criteria that you need to know to pick the best one for you. So the first thing you need to think about is, what kind of nature journaling are you going to be doing? Are you going to be standing up? Are you going to be walking around out in the field and trying to sketch while you're standing? Are you going to be doing watercolor? Are you going to be doing a lot of writing? What types of pens or pencils are you going to be using? And what types of locations are you going to be nature journaling in? First thing I'm going to talk about is size. When it comes to nature journaling, size is important, and it's actually one of the main things that you can manipulate to get the most out of your nature journaling and get the best practice drawing. I've gone from things this small all the way up to these, which I use now, which are 9 by 12, and these small things are really great and convenient. I use these while nature journaling in Tanzania, and I would carry this on the bus with me because it's so small. It also could be in your front pocket, like on a plane, or on a hike. Like if you're backpacking, you could have this in your front pocket. Or if you're just getting into nature journaling from birding, one thing you could do is just combine some little sketches like this with your birding journal. So a small size like this, some people just like the convenience because they know they can always have their nature journal with them, and it's really easy to pull out. But what I've found personally is that although sometimes I'll do like a big spread like this and actually really use a lot of drawing, what ends up happening is I draw a lot less when I have a journal this size. So this is a really small moleskin. These are not very resilient. The binding won't last for that long. It's a soft cover binding. The paper's pretty light. I can't remember the exact poundage, but as you saw there, it could take a little bit of a wash. But these aren't gonna, hold up for very long. They're not super tough, but just having something like this with you all the time is good as an option. So try this out. You can try out a small one. If you notice you're not using it very much though, that means you need to get a different type of sketchbook. So next one I'm gonna look at is this sketchbook right here. I bought a bunch of these for a kids program. This is low cost of entry style as well as that last one, and if you're doing something with kids, this could be a good choice just because if it ends up not getting used too much, it's not that big of an investment. I'll show you some of the sketches I've done on here, but this is also not going to hold up to watercolor very well at all. This is mostly pencil, and as you can see, this book did not get finished. I was using this a little bit during a kids program, and then I basically stopped using it afterwards because I'd much rather carry something with superior paper and a hardbound cover. This is, as you can see, almost twice as big as this last one, and this could fit into a lot of places, but you do have some problems at this size as it starts getting really easy to bend this way, and when you're actually drawing, it's hard for me I can't draw standing up very easily with this paper unless it were attached onto something else. Once it's attached onto something else, that kind of defeats the purpose of having a sketchbook. So these are okay if you're going to do something with kids, especially really young kids. And once again, if you notice that it's not getting filled up, it's not getting used, then there might be something wrong with that sketchbook. And always choose whichever one you find you end up filling more, and sometimes that might have to do with quality. So I'm going to jump around a little bit and skip to some bigger size journals. Hopefully that's okay with you, because I just need to talk about this quality thing and whether it affects your drawing or not. So someone gave me this really cool sketchbook. I mean, this thing is nice. It feels nice. The design is great. And the paper just feels really yummy. And I've been afraid to draw in this book basically since I was given this book. I haven't even drawn anything in it, I don't think. Look at that. So this is a really great sketchbook, and I think it would be good for nature journaling. It would be good for me in a lot of ways. It's pretty big. It feels like it's bigger than 9 by 12 actually, and I haven't drawn at all in this book. So that's one thing to notice. That's the main, most important thing when deciding your sketchbook. So you can always buy a new one, but if you notice that there's one, it might not be you. It might not be that you don't have enough interesting things to draw. It might not be that you don't have enough time to draw. It might just be that you need to get a different sketchbook, because either your sketchbook is not appealing to you or it's so good that you're too precious about it. All right, so let's get back into the small ones here real quick. So next up is going to be like a size like this. This size is still, if for me, I could draw standing up with this, but this is probably the type of book I would use. I would still draw sitting down. For me, the sweet spot comes in at these 9 by 12s. This is the Stillman and Byrne that I always use, and it just fits perfectly in my arm like this, so I can draw standing up. It's hardback too, which is really important. So here's an example of one that's almost 9 by 12, but is soft on the front. The back is hard, but not as hard as my Stillman and Byrne, and I haven't ended up using that one hardly at all. So that's how I would look at size. The size is going to be really important for whether you're drawing standing up or whether you're drawing sitting down, and then it's also going to have to do with the appeal of that paper. So like I said, with what I noticed for myself is that when I have a smaller journal, I end up using it less. Here is an example of a Stillman and Byrne journal that's a little bit smaller than what was ideal for me, and I tried a whole season basically of nature journaling inside of this book, and I just found that this size was a little bit restricting to me, and I wasn't enjoying nature journaling as much or even getting out as much. Here's some bird sketches that I did in there. And I immediately switched back to the other size ones after I used this. Here was a really cool osprey nature journaling trip that I went on, but this size to me, it fits all right in my arm. It's easier to put into the scanner, it's true, and I can still fold this over and draw on it here, but I just found that there wasn't enough space. It felt like it was cramping. However, now that I'm up on this, up to this size right here, I end up drawing a lot more. So the next really important thing to take into consideration is binding. The main types of binding that you're going to have to choose between are spiral bound, wire bound, such as this, and that comes in different, there are quite a few variations of what that could look like. And the other binding option, the other main binding option that you will see is fabric bound, like this, where the pages are sewn in, and in the middle they look like this. On the wire bound, the middle is going to look like that, so it creates a gutter, and some people really care about that because they like to do drawings that go across both pages like this. When you have the wire in the middle, it takes away from the ability to create this, and a lot of people really like that. And then another option would be, and this is, I would not really consider this a sketchbook, but there are watercolor papers that come glued together, and some of them even you can flip the pages a little bit, but they will eventually fall out. So for nature journaling, I actually don't recommend this type of binding at all unless you take pages from this and like glue them into your nature journal. And then the last option for binding would be like a homemade binding such as this, where you take whatever paper you want, drill holes through some type of cardstock, and then just use rope or whatever. So when you're out here nature journaling, binding really matters. So a lot of times I'm drawing standing up like this, and when I hold my sketchbook standing up, I use the frame of the sketchbook as a sort of brace, and that creates a table. Combined with my forearm, I basically have a table here now. And so that possibility is due to this type of binding where I can completely lay back my pages. And you can see I use these clips here to hold it down, and that works especially well and creates a really tight frame and a really great structure. Now, if I were using a book that is bound with fabric such as this, a lot of them do not lay flat. See that? And if they do, you're sometimes causing damage to that binding. And you can see this book here has pretty damaged binding. So with this one, some of them can lay flat, and I do have the option of drawing through the gutter, so you can get that cool layout where it crosses between the two pages. But other than that, there's not very much benefit to this. The only other benefit that some people have pointed out to me is that the paper in these cloth bound ones is not moving around from side to side as much, whereas theoretically when the paper is bound this way, it can actually move around, and for graphite drawings that can be a problem. The other consideration with the binding of books is how they fit into your bag. So I'm adamant about reducing friction as much as possible when I'm out in the field nature journaling. And if something gets caught every time I try to put it into my bag or take it out, that's going to be a problem. Some journals, I don't have any examples here, but some sketchbooks actually have corners cut off, and when these corners are rounded, it makes it easier to stick in and out. Sometimes spiral bounding can be a problem this way, especially on landscape format sketchbooks such as this, where the binding is on the side, and that's exactly the side that's going to be running into things as it tries to go into my little side bag here. So that's why binding matters, and those are some of the things you should be thinking about when you choose your binding. The only other thing I can think of is that when you put your books on a shelf, some people like seeing this as opposed to seeing this. And you can't write cool things or put calligraphy on this. On this binding, you could put the dates, for example, or any other information, and then when they're up on your shelf, that would look really cool. Another consideration for you to think about when choosing your sketchbook for nature journaling is the orientation and the ratio. So on this, you can see that this is in a portrait format, and portrait is just in that tradition of when people are drawn, they're drawn more upright. This is also seems to be pretty standard for writing, and this type of format is pretty good for both of those things. Now, some people will complain, well, I'm not writing or doing portraits, I like doing landscapes, for example, and they might like a more landscape format. So there are sketchbooks that have that type of format, and you don't have to get wire bound ones. They can be really cool, and a lot of urban sketchers use them to great advantage. However, you do not need this shape of a sketchbook to put this shape of a drawing in. One thing that I do is I frame my drawings within my paper, because I do like this this portrait format. This is 9x12. I like that because of how it fits in my arm and how it fits in my backpack, my side bag. But I'm not limited to drawing portrait shaped drawings, because what I do is I create my own frames on the page, and I actually like the layout options that I have with this upright or portrait style format. There are different ratios. So for example, this book here has another portrait shape, but it's slightly different. So there's a lot of variation with them, but it is one thing to take into consideration. All right, now I get to talk about paper. So paper can be either super simple or super complicated. There's 3 main types that nature journalists are probably going to consider. First would be watercolor. This paper is made specifically for watercolor and is often made out of 100% cotton. Next would be mixed media paper. Mixed media paper can range in weight and in texture, and will be acceptable for a lot of different techniques, and probably not the ideal for watercolor. And then another one that I'll talk about briefly is Bristol. Bristol paper is pretty heavy and can be good for markers, pencils, colored pencils, and ink, but is not always the best for watercolor. and is a little bit heavier. For nature journaling, you probably just want a plain mixed media paper. The one I really like is the Stillman and Byrne Alpha series, and this paper is 150 GSM. It has a medium surface, it's white, and is a mixed media paper that works pretty well for the watercolor that I do. Sometimes I can use up to like 4 washes on a piece, and it holds up pretty well. It's not the greatest for wet on wet, but I don't rely too heavily on wet on wet. Here you can see a pretty wet landscape that I painted and did fine, and it hardly buckled the paper at all. So this is a mixed media paper that I really like. So you don't even need to know any more about paper if you know that, but I'll go a little bit more in depth just in case you need the extra detail. Alright, so paper is made out of different things, and for nature journaling purposes, this isn't super critical, but if you get more into watercolor and are really into landscape paintings in watercolor, for example, then having 100% cotton paper will definitely help. For nature journaling, you don't need 100% cotton, and a lot of times they're a mixture, even in watercolor paper, so that is the material that the paper is made out of. Next thing to know about paper in your sketchbook is the weight. So this one can be really confusing, partly because there's different measurement systems. So the weight of your paper is actually how heavy it is, and that's an important factor when considering washes. It's also an important factor when considering the capacity of your journal, because if you're getting paper that's 300 GSM, that's heavy paper, look how thick that is. That is a pretty thick page. So what that means is you get fewer pages in a journal. And if you're going on a big trip or you're backpacking, that might be something to consider. Also, if you're going through journals really fast, it's another thing to consider. Then the next thing that's important is that weight allows you to do big washes. So if you have heavier paper, you can use more wet media. If you're not using any wet media, there's no reason really to get heavier paper. So this measurement is given in 2 different ways. Sometimes you only see one or the other, and so that's a little bit annoying. And so the weight is measured in pounds. So this watercolor paper here is 140 pounds or 300 GSM, and that's grams per square meter. So the annoying thing is that the pounds is related to a specific size of paper, so I think it's not always equivalent, and the metric measurement is based on a surface area and is always consistent. So anyways, I try to remember the GSM over the pounds. So this is probably overkill. This particular type is probably overkill for most of your nature journaling purposes, and what I generally use is 150 GSM. So that's my sketchbook that I showed you before, my Stillman and Byrne, and I've been using this paper for a while, and it's only 150 GSM, but I do some pretty wet stuff on there, and I don't get too much buckling, and I end up with, instead of just 25 pages in this journal, I get like 50. So that is a major thing to take into consideration. Also, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the surface. The surface is the texture of the paper, and you can see this paper has a lot. Other papers hardly have any. Usually if you get really light paper, it has almost no surface at all, and the surface has a big effect on watercolor washes. It also has an effect on how your pen or pencil moves or doesn't move across the paper. Here you can see on this totally smooth paper, I did a pretty, I would say, a pretty brave wash for this thin of paper, and it didn't create any interesting watercolory patterns. So one of the things that people like about watercolor is the texture and the effects that you can get from it, and that is highly dependent on the paper that you are using and its texture. So here you can see I just did a shadow violet wash, pretty simple, but on this paper it looks a lot better because you get more of a natural pattern, a little natural randomness. So that is this paper texture is from this Kilimanjaro watercolor paper, and that is, the texture is called cold pressed. So this is another code language that you have to learn. There's different types of texture are rated by what type of press. There's cold press, medium press, and hot press. It has something to do with how the paper is made and the temperatures when they're doing that process. And so what you need to remember is that cold pressed is rough, medium is in between, and hot pressed will be really smooth. So this is an example of cold pressed. You can see the texture there, and you can see how it affects the washes. Now let me show you a multimedia paper, which is for my Stillman and Burn. And multimedia paper is usually a pretty consistently smooth tooth. Tooth is the other code word to talk about texture of paper. So this is pretty smooth here. You can see there is a little bit of texture. It's not completely hot pressed. However, you can see that I don't get very much wet on wet effect, and these are pretty granulating colors that I'm using here, but there's almost no interesting wet on wet texture. You can see here another example of a painting I did where if this were on a more textured paper, I would probably be getting more interesting effects, but I'd say it still works out pretty well. Now that is to compare with that small one. This is not good. So you can see there's these weird little dots forming where the fibers of the paper are, and it's just kind of distracting overall. There's a lot less options of what you can do with watercolor when you're using paper with this type of texture. That being said, if you are doing a botanical illustration, or you're doing a lot of ink work or using pens or colored pencils, a smooth texture could be really good. And especially with the fine pen work. And for nature journaling, you know, we need to write stuff a lot of times. So what I found was that the cold pressed paper really got in the way of my writing and made it a lot harder to make notes and use arrows. Now in my nature journaling, I need to make notes and use arrows, so that's kind of a deal breaker for me with paper that is this textured. Now, one option you could do is you could cut out pieces of paper like this, glue them into locations in your nature journal where you want to do a big landscape painting, and then just do your writing next to that. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about cover material. So this is another thing that varies a lot in between journals, and it will affect your nature journaling in the field, but it will also affect the appearance when your nature journal is complete. So for example, this is a sort of faux leather finish, and there is such a finish on many different types of sketchbooks, but it varies a lot in its quality or lack thereof. Another thing that can be super annoying is stickers such as this that don't peel off completely. That is a huge pet peeve of mine, and look at how much it affects the appearance of this journal. Now this one's kind of cool because it almost looks like India right here and part of Asia going over to Africa, so it almost looks like a map of the world, but usually that's just a really distracting and annoying thing. So this is a Canson right here, and this is kind of old, but yeah, that's just super annoying, and I've seen that on a lot of things. However, this is a hardcover material, and that makes a difference for nature journaling, because a lot of times when we're nature journaling in the field, if we're nature journaling standing up, we need that hard cover so that we can draw well in the field. And this applies to urban sketching as well. That hard cover is really essential. Now, hard covers vary a lot too. Like this looks like it should be hard and is a pretty thick piece of cardboard, but this, especially in this format, ends up being way too flexy, and that would be really hard to draw on. You can see how much that, when you put pressure on it, that is gonna bend like crazy. Now, that is still better than something like this or similar super soft covers that are really flexy. That flexiness just doesn't work when you're trying to draw standing up. And the only other thing that matters, you know, is like the quality. So I'd say the Stillman and Burn is pretty good, but it still is sort of plasticky. I've seen some other ones that are even fancier. Depends on how much you want to pay for a sketchbook, and this is a really nice one, but as you can see, like taking out into the field, I already got some weird ice plant goop stuck on it. So that's purely aesthetic. The stiffness, however, is very functional. The last criteria for your sketchbook is the paper color. There's a lot of different types of white, and there's also tone paper, which I don't have here, but that comes in a variety of colors. Those can be good when you're using gouache, like I said earlier. And here you can see that this is a slightly off-white color paper that I used to use, and I like the feeling of it, and it gives sort of a tone to your whole journal. But what I don't like is that it affects your colors a lot. So as you can see here, the colors are affected quite a bit, and I just get more brightness with the pure white paper that I'm using now. Like this landscape would not have been possible on that paper. However, people are doing a lot of great nature journaling with toned paper. Now you know the main criteria when choosing a sketchbook for nature journaling. But I'm going to leave you with one last piece of information that is super important. That is this. Remember, your sketchbook is a tool. It's meant to be used and to make you a better artist and nature journaler. If you find yourself leaving on the wall or leaving at home or hardly opening it or being too afraid to draw on it, then there's a problem. Choose a different sketchbook. None of the other criteria matter if you're not actually using it. It doesn't matter if it's theoretically right for the type of media you're using, or someone that you highly admire recommended it. If it's something that you're not using, get a new one and think about why it is that you're not using it and change that with your next sketchbook. I make videos like this every week to help you get more out of your nature journaling. And if you want to get more involved in the projects that I'm doing, check out my Patreon down below. I have like 12 people on there that sponsor me right now and help me make this content. Bye.